Hello there, dear listeners. I am bringing you a probably unexpected conversation. I haven't had a guest on in a while on the show. Been so busy doing these deep dives and monologues on unsavory IDW characters. So I thought maybe a change would be nice, and that I should dust some cobwebs off my conversational skills and chat with Chris Kavanagh of Decoding the Gurus podcast. He is also an IDW critic. I'm sure we have many overlapping listeners, so you probably know him already. Why, yes, you are tuning in, basically, to hear two podcasts that talk about podcasts, talk to each other on a podcast about more podcasts, and also to discuss our respective podcasts about podcasts. If that makes any sense. Are you ready for this? Jokes aside, though, there is a bit of a background to why I wanted to have this chat, so let me try and sum that up quickly in case someone is tuning in with fresh ears, someone that doesn't follow the IDW sphere and its critics very closely. I did notice while editing our conversation that there were a lot of parts that were quite inside baseball-y. I guess when you cover this stuff so frequently, you tend to assume that everyone listening at this point is at least somewhat familiar with all the surrounding little backstories and characters and stuff. So my apologies if something or someone wasn't adequately explained. I did add a couple of clips after the fact of conversations that were being referenced. At other times, there were various podcast episodes that were being referred to, like my 2016 conversation with Sam Harris, as well as Chris's recent conversation with him. I will link both of those in the show notes. And he referenced my recent episode on Rogan a couple of times, I think, as well as my mini-series on Harris, Woking Up, both of which I will also link. Other than that, we mentioned an Alex Jonesian conspiracy theory book called Eurabia, where Harris pulled some Muslim birth rate fear-mongering from. We talked about former neo-Nazi Christian Picciolini that Harris had this big public falling out with because he thought Christian was too harsh on Stefan Molyneux. I actually had a conversation with Christian not too long after that went down. I will link that in the notes too, so if you want to hear more backstory on that whole thing, you can look there and hear directly from Christian. I think that should cover what I thought people might not know. But anyway, so yeah, I wanted to have this chat for two reasons mainly. One, because I thought it would be interesting to compare notes with someone else who has had a similar sort of conversation with Harris, where there was quite a bit of pushback. And the second reason is that in Chris's chat with Sam, he played a clip of my chat with Sam, and in passing mentioned that I was not a fan of their show, Decoding the Gurus, either, but that's all that was said. Understandably, they were in the middle of another conversation. But I ended up getting a bunch of DMs and emails after that from people asking why I am not a fan or what my thoughts on Decoding the Gurus are. So I thought it might be good to elaborate on our differences, and maybe then people can stop asking me about it. Yeah. So I tried to keep the two parts of the conversation separate so that they wouldn't interfere with one another. This first episode is just us comparing notes on experiences with Harris. If you're more interested in my critique / our differences, that is covered in the second episode. Both episodes are available to patrons immediately, so if you're not subscribed there, you should do that now so you can get this mammoth-sized, extremely rational conversation all at once. We actually had a pretty good chat, I think. It ended up being 4 hours long, so I had to split it into 2 episodes. So as not to torture everyone with a 4-hour release. And despite the length of it, we still couldn't get through everything I wanted to touch upon because you know how normal human conversations go. You get sidetracked and go on tangents and things. But it was certainly good to clear some things up and also interesting to hear Chris's thoughts after he's had some time to, I guess, process his discussion with Sam. Surprisingly, in this part of the conversation, we agreed way more than I expected to. As many of you will know, my experiences with several man podcasters in the IDW critical sphere even haven't been so great. Surely you remember MergeGate. So this was a nice change. As for our differences, I guess you can sum them up as what would naturally arise between more centrist critique of the IDW and more left-leaning critique, where I might perceive something as softballing or minimizing, and he might perceive the way in which I criticize certain figures to be too harsh, maybe. But we'll save the details of that for the next part. I did want to stress, though, in case it didn't come across in the chat, that I do think very much that Harris not being an anti-vaxxer is an extremely low bar, especially when he has propped up and highly praised so many of these figures that have turned out to be misinformation spreading hacks now. And especially also as he sympathizes with the wokeness made me do it shoddy reasoning. And I think you do not gotta hand it to people like Claire Lehman of Quillette, since I feel that legitimizes her for also crossing the lowest bar in the universe. We didn't get to dive too deeply into those differences, but I did feel I needed to highlight them here, so I would be happy to hear feedback, pushback, or criticism from Chris on that. Anyway, I think Chris was very generous with his time, and having a fairly centrist audience that often does not like me apart from our overlapping listeners. I think he definitely deserves some credit for coming on here and even agreeing with things that will probably upset a whole bunch of people. So hey, kudos for that. And now, the episode.
Make sure that that program doesn't contain controversial subjects, and you're not impolite to people.
No, definitely not, Dad. You know me. I'm never, ever controversial or impolite.
Yeah, okay.
Welcome to Conversations with your lovable, never pisses anyone off, ex-Muslim host Aina, keeping it non-controversial. Hello and welcome to Polite Conversations, everyone. I am having a guest on after what seems like forever. Today I will be speaking with a fellow IDW critic, someone with a bit of a different approach to mine, and many of you will know Chris Kavanagh from the Decoding the Gurus podcast. So hello, Chris. How's it going?
Hello, Aina. Good evening, I guess, for you, and good morning for me. International Skyping. No wonder.
That's right. You're talking to us from the next day.
That's right. And it's no better today. I'm sorry. It's not got any better. Everything's still going to shit. I'm sorry.
Damn it. But at least we're able to have this conversation, so we will save civilization a little bit.
That is true. It's hard to overestimate the power of long-form podcasting. Perhaps it might be arrogant to say, but we might be able to save Ukraine.
Oh my God!
This conversation.
Oh my God!
Who knows?
I was afraid you were going to make that joke, but I did set you up for that. So, yeah.
I will say that, just to be clear, that I don't think the situation in Ukraine at all is a laughing matter. It's more that I genuinely think that various people that we might talk about will present their podcasts as being the potential salvation for that conflict. So yeah, I apologize about this joke. It's a terrible event, just to be clear.
Right. Yeah. So it's interesting talking to you, because I think a lot of people have wanted us to talk to each other for a while. And I got a chance to hear your Sam Harris podcast a while ago and thought it was very interesting. And
very long.
Yes, very long. Very long. A lot. I listened to a bunch of your episodes to prepare for this conversation.
God bless you. I'm very sorry.
And
I'm very sorry.
Yeah, you don't make it any easier than any other IDW member.
No.
Every conversation you guys have is 3 hours long as well.
Yeah, and that's the edited down version. I prefer to blame it on just the tendency amongst academics to be long-winded. But it also it's partly a function of, we always do this thing where we're supposed to look at a single piece of content, and then when we're doing it, we end up adding like 2 or 3 more, as I'm sure you're familiar, like your recent episode, right? You finished recording, then Sam releases his take on Joe Rogan, and then you kind of feel like, okay, I've got all these clips, and I want to mention this point, and maybe you don't need to, but it feels like you're not doing it justice if you don't cover it. So yeah, we definitely lean towards keeping more stuff in, which is your mileage on that may vary, but I think it's in our nature as academic-y type people to be long-winded.
I mean, I'm not an academic at all, and I can still relate because I have trouble cutting things down as well, because I think it's also a bit just to do with this whole IDW sphere. There's a lot of slipperiness happening, and it's hard to pin down things unless you have a lot of wider context around it.
Yeah, I spoke recently to, I'm sure you're familiar with him, Timba on Toast. He makes like YouTube videos. He did a good one on Dave Rubin, and I think it was a 7-part series on James O'Keefe. And he's currently doing the series on Tim Pool. And when we talk to him, you would imagine like debunking Tim Pool. What's the debunk? He's a cretin, right? He's a really stupid guy. But to kind of highlight even how somebody like him is being duplicitous and presenting themselves as one way and so on, it took him like months and months of collating the clips, and then editing, and his videos are very effective, but it's kind of regrettable that people have to go to that length to demonstrate something which seems like it should be obvious just from looking at the thumbnails on his YouTube channel, but it isn't for lots of people. So I think this is something that many people find when they're trying to debunk, that the amount of effort to highlight what people are doing is much greater than the people can kind of spew out their talking points, like, James Lindsay style.
Yeah. Yep. And Sam Harris style also, but...
yeah, indeed. And, I'm sure we'll get onto, but in the conversation I had with Sam, and I listened to your conversation in preparation before. I listened to a bunch of conversations, actually. But you did a better job than I did of Sam kind of goes on extended monologues for, a lot. And he'll put in a whole bunch of points and in response to a question, which are kind of not really related, but they raise different issues. And then when it comes your point where you have a chance to speak, you're kind of like, okay, well, there's 8 things I need to respond to there, but I've only got 2 minutes before I'll have to hand back. So yeah, that's frustrating.
Yeah, it's like a Gish Gallop technique, kind of.
Yeah, and I will say I haven't been on the receiving end of that much from, I've been interested in conspiracy theories and so on, but I haven't debated conspiracy theories or conspiracy theorists or creationists like in a audio format, and that's it's surprisingly difficult to deal with when you are experiencing it firsthand. So, as I say, when I listened to your interview, I think in part because you were more willing to, interrupt and say, no, that's not the point I'm making, and I wasn't particularly effective at that, but yeah.
Well, I am just a crazy woman, right? So
that's your advantage. But I don't think that I am excluded from the criteria of like unhinged critics in Sam's perspective. But
you think?
But maybe I'm not quite in the pantheon that you've reached. You, Ezra Klein, and Robert Wright are seemingly like, mortal enemies, and Glenn Greenwald as well.
Yeah, well, so Ezra Klein has the intellectual and moral integrity of the KKK, if I'm remembering correctly. That's what he said about Salon and Vox.
Yeah.
Writers.
I'm meeting the same level of demagoguery and dishonesty and cynicism and just mere gamesmanship on the left, much closer to where we all are living. Like, so it's like just interacting with a reporter from Salon or Vox, right? Like who's there? I'm meeting someone who essentially has the intellectual and moral integrity of the guy in the white hood, over on the right, and that asymmetry is just totally alarming to me.
Yeah. So we'll just do a couple more minutes on politics, and then we'll shift to some stuff. So,
slightly hyperbolic, yes.
Just a tad, especially when Nazis are nowhere and the KKK is nowhere and it's all extremely fringe. It's just bizarre that there would be so many Nazi-like people all over Vox and Salon. And I'm just crazy.
Yeah. There's I watched. I don't know if you've seen it. It's on the BBC, but Louis Theroux has a new series, and his first episode was about basically the new manifestation of the alt-right. Nick Fuentes and Becca Lewis and all that, and it looks very, very familiar, and the fringe of the fringe seems to have a significant audience, and one that reaches into the Republican Party or the right-wing institutions in the US quite far. So
right.
So yeah, I just feel that maybe watching some of those documentaries might be helpful. Louis Theroux's documentaries are entertaining as well, so maybe somebody could forward it to Sam.
Do you think really it's about not knowing or just not accepting? Because, he does say things like, they are fringe of the fringe apart from capturing the presidency.
Yeah, I cannot square the logic of that kind of statement very clearly. But I also think there is a degree of willful blindness, because, for example, when I brought up Tucker Carlson with Sam and what he's doing on Fox News, he was very quick to say, I don't watch Tucker, I don't know his content, so I can't really comment on that. But I don't live in the US, I don't watch Fox, but I see the same clips everyone else does on social media, and it's not hard to see what Tucker's doing, and it's so I find, if you ask, is Sam being honest when he says that, it's hard for me to tell if he is being, willfully blind to that, or that he is extending charity in an extremely uneven manner towards people that are the targets of left-wing criticism, because that seems to be a recurrent pattern. So, yeah.
Right. Well, from your conversation with him, it seemed like you did have your mind kind of made up about him having a very imbalanced perception of these things. Like,
it is.
Right? It is a very clear pattern. And you played the clip from my conversation with him in 2016, pointing out the troubling stuff with Gad and Rubin, to which he responded, that I just must be mistaken because they are extremely ethical people with a very journalistic agenda. And
I mean, the thing that surprised me about that was partly what I anticipated, probably naively, was that, when faced with kind of criticism pointing out some of these issues and blind spots, that Sam might take the opportunity to moderate his position and to mention, that he had made some mistakes or judgments that, now he would regret, and he should have spotted the warning signs. But that wasn't the way that he responded. And when it came to, the fact that when I listened to that episode, because I'd heard you on your content mention, that you didn't want to go back and listen to it because it was a number of years ago, and you might feel, a bit uncomfortable, being charitable to Sam, given what you've documented since then. But when I went back and listened, I was, because I hadn't heard it the first time around, I think, and I was really impressed that, even though you were being, polite and nice to Sam, you still really clearly laid out the problems, and you didn't, back down whenever he issued the points about his kind of standard rebuttal about it. You were saying, but I've laid out to you the kind of people that they're platforming, the kind of things they're saying, so why would you not acknowledge that now? And it struck me that when a lot of people talk about these kind of issues like Brett Weinstein or whatever, they kind of present it as if there were not people making reasonable critiques and highlighting these issues clearly, right? It's always presented as it was like the extreme left wing just, attacking anybody who went off the orthodoxy. But that conversation was really clear and laid out the problems. And then, as you say, his reaction was to kind of say, well, you haven't understood this properly. And if I could sit you down in the room with Dave, you'd see that he's a good person. And it felt like that doesn't matter.
But I was willing to do that. I was happy to speak with Dave. And I think it would still be pretty hilarious to do that now. Like, I wouldn't be against it. But, it's Dave that would, that blocked me and didn't even want to talk about any issues, even on Twitter, even though he supposedly was such a great ally to ex-Muslims. I would even say, like, hey, as an ex-Muslim, like, before I knew much about Dave, I tweeted to him, I think, like, hey, what, from what I've seen, I think you are an ally to ex-Muslims, but I think that you're wrong here. Like, people like Tommy Robinson or Pat Condell are not good people. They're not good critics of Islam, and he just blocked me for that kind of stuff. So,
but the thing that strikes me as interesting is that so even if you were unduly charitable and took it as, well, they were acting in good faith at that moment then, and they just didn't see, the signs that people were pointing out. The bit that I don't get, and still seems really prevalent, is that now, right, it's 2022, so you can look back and you can see the trajectory of all these people. You can see what happened on COVID, and you can say, okay, so I missed something, and the heterodox sphere has some problem, that a large percentage of it went into COVID denialism and like Great Reset conspiracies. Like that's an issue, and I didn't identify that. And yet it does seem that not just Sam, but a whole range of people, they kind of see it as, oh, those people went crazy and it's impossible to explain what happened. It's like kind of a mystery. And it doesn't seem that mysterious. It seems that, they were always more tolerant to right-wing narratives and applying double standards, and they got love bombed by the right, and then a bunch of them also had long-standing conspiracy tendencies. So I do think that there's a kind of lacking thing in the whole heterodox sphere towards acknowledging the things that they didn't pick up on. With Brett Weinstein and Gad Saad and the whole crew, James Lindsay.
Right. I mean, even in your conversation with Sam, when you played him that clip, he said to you something like, oh, back then I didn't, know enough about them to know how bad they were, even though he's the one that knew them personally, and he's the one that used to share their awful content that I actually specifically pointed out to him within our conversation. And I was like, hey, you see, this is what they're doing, is that they're putting out these people into the world without much context around them, like Anne-Marie Waters, who's too extreme for fucking UKIP. But Sam, here you are tweeting that out to everyone and saying this is like a brilliant conversation.
Yeah.
It's not that he didn't know enough, it's that he liked it. He liked what they were putting out. And I don't know why he can't just admit that he was wrong in retrospect, because it is beyond obvious now how wrong he was in judging so many people. And I do appreciate that you tried to push back on that a fair bit, though he didn't let you talk much, and I think your co-host just completely tapped out after a while.
We were communicating via, the chat box about like the way to ask questions to make them more effective, but none of it. Like there was an attempt where I kind of said, okay, I'm going to, front load the question by saying, okay, let me just outline 2 points, right, and then I'll give you a chance to respond. But usually that makes people not respond until you outline the 2 points. But but Sam is somewhat unique in that didn't prevent them from jumping in at points. So the one thing that struck me, and it struck me when I was listening back to the conversation. I mean, I also brought up the point with Sam about he wouldn't be surprised if there was a 50-50 chance that France would fall into civil war within 10 years. Because when I was listening to that when I was driving back in the car, and I remember going like, what? That's, what are you talking about? And that felt like a very extreme claim, even by the standards. Yes, there had been the Bastille attack and all that, but that's talking about a civil war in a Western democracy within a decade. Yeah. And I find that very extreme. And you highlighted, I don't know the figures, I have to say, as well as you do, about Anne-Marie Waters, and I'm aware of Tommy Robinson and some of those figures. But the fact that Sam would say that those people are saying very sensible things about immigration, about the threats of Islam, and so on.
Yes, specifically those topics too. The things that they are, it's not like he's like, she has some good recipes that she puts on YouTube or whatever, completely unrelated. He is specifically interested in her views on immigration. And Tommy Robinson, like he said to Mariam Namazi in a conversation, again, I don't know enough about him, so I'm not really defending him. But if you listen to his conversation with Dave Rubin, again, something else that he promoted, he is making perfect sense in that conversation. There is nothing, absolutely nothing bigoted that he says there. And
I'll give you an example of this. So, for instance, Tommy Robinson just did an interview with Dave Rubin where he made sense, really perfect sense, for an hour and did not say a single bigoted thing. Right now, I'm not very familiar with Tommy Robinson. I don't live in the UK. And I just know that he is under the shadow of more or less constant accusations of racism and bigotry. And yet I hear him speak for an hour, and even when pressed on the topic of past associations with bigots, he made perfect sense and talked about how he left the EDL because of those racist elements that came into it.
Nothing, absolutely nothing bigoted that he says there. And then I went back and re-listened to the Dave Rubin conversation with Tommy Robinson, because I remember finding it horrifying even in 2016 or 15 or whenever it was. Yeah. And it is borderline white nationalists, hordes and hordes of Muslim men are coming to rape our women, and Somali immigrants are coming, and it's horrifying. And that specific conversation is what he said was that, if you don't know anything about Tommy and you heard that, you'd think he was perfectly reasonable. Well, no, because he's extremist even in that.
Yeah, and it wasn't like his background was hidden at that time either. This is something that I've noted as something which I definitely think Sam lacks, and I think a whole bunch of people, another interest of mine is the Weinsteins, and they are lacking in this regard as well, is that right after Sam referenced that conversation, you went back and listened to it and checked, right? You kind of were like, okay, I remember it like this, but it wasn't as bad as I remember. So you went and did the annoying thing of going and listening to a conversation. But a lot of times with Sam and others in that space, they'll kind of reference their impression. And if you say something like, I asked Sam, you were talking about the Christchurch shooter manifesto. You talked about like 3 times on a podcast over a couple of months. Yeah. But you didn't read it, right? It takes like 30 minutes to read. And you were debating with people about what the content means, but you didn't read it. And that tendency to not do research or to not just okay, so is Tommy Robinson okay? Spend 2 days, do some research on what he's done and what his background is. I actually tried to raise this point about Stefan Molyneux, and we got sidetracked on the Christian Picciolini. Yeah, and the point I wanted to make with the Stefan Molyneux raising was not actually to do with that, although we ended up debating what the technical definition of Holocaust denial is, but
Jesus Christ, yeah, I remember that.
But what I wanted to point out to Sam was that with that Stefan Molyneux stuff, before any conversation with Christian, there was about 3 years where Stefan was brought up periodically in Sam's monologues, and at one point he mentioned that he was the second most requested guest after Jordan Peterson. And his monologues were always saying, now, I've heard bad things about this guy. I've seen some concerning clips, but I haven't researched it. I haven't looked into it. I know that people get smeared, so I don't want to take a position. And, that's okay the first time. Yeah. But when it's, a year has passed and you're still saying, I don't want to pass judgment. There's this guy that people are calling white nationalist. I don't know. And I kind of think, if this is the second most requested guest and people are saying he's a white nationalist and he'll convert into a Trump apologist, right? But why not spend, even, God forbid, a couple of days to do the research on Stefan Molyneux's content and then take a position? Because it's not hard to discover all the terrible misogynistic, racist stuff that Molyneux had put out. Even Joe Rogan managed to unearth some clips on his second appearance on his show. So I really do criticize Sam and others within the IDW for that. It's either charitable blindness or it's strategic ignorance, so that they don't have to condemn someone that maybe some of their audience would like. And you can take the cynical or non-cynical perspective, but in either case, both things are bad.
Now, which one do you lean towards?
Well, so with Stefan Molyneux specifically, I think it's similar to the Christchurch shooter manifesto, where I think Sam is so confident in his takes and his parsing of what the real issues are, that he kind of doesn't think that's the real topic, or he has better things to concern himself with than people talking about the alt-right growing on YouTube channels or that kind of thing. I think he regarded that as a moral panic promoted by the woke left, and that our real concerns were the rise of Islamism and all.
Well, and also kids reading Ibram Kendi in high schools.
Yes, and I mean that's you've done this really clearly on your episodes, kind of exhaustively. But when you contrast how confident that Sam or other people in the IDW, they are with just condemning all liberal institutions, all of academia, all of left-wing media as like corrupted and untrustworthy, and it's, you know, we cannot trust those sources anymore. And then when it comes to right-wing stuff like Tucker Carlson, which to me, it's a free ball for people, you know, at least to just have a little bit of both siders defense if they just say, yeah, that stuff is terrible too. But even then, a bunch of them find it really hard to say, you know, they take the stance, well, I haven't watched it. And I know that Fox News is bad, but everyone knows that, so we don't need to spend time on it. But meanwhile, Peter Boghossian is currently in Hungary, you know, giving lectures for Orban's government. And that to me seems, you know, if you were somebody that was concerned about radicalization and about, you know, creeping totalitarianism and stuff, you have to be concerned about what's happening on the right. If I don't see how you can do it evenly, but, you know, if you really have to do it evenly, you have to at least recognize what's happening on the right. And there does seem to be a willful blindness or a sympathy there that that goes unacknowledged.
So you lean more towards the willful blindness then, as opposed to just not doing research every single time?
It depends on the character, but I definitely don't think it's an evenly distributed, you know, blindness to topics. Like there's much greater sympathy if you take Sam, like, displayed towards Tucker Carlson than to like a public figure like AOC, right? And I know that he would frame that as, well, that's because, you know, AOC is on my side, like the liberal side, so I feel fine being more critical of her. But really, I mean, how much are Sam and other people praising AOC for the parts that they agree on? Like nothing. Yeah. Right?
So this is all stuff that people used to say about Rubin. Like, this is all the exact same excuses, you know, cleaning up my own side. That's why I don't even talk about the right. And what was the other thing? Oh, yeah, I don't know. I didn't have enough time, or I didn't know enough about this guy. That's why I can't take a stance on him. Rubin used to use all these same excuses. I mean, Rubin even said he didn't have the budget. Like, what budget do I have? Like,
it's hard.
I'm a freelance, you know. I don't have a budget, but I have Google, and I can just look people up. So that's just a nonsense excuse.
It's very hard. You need the extra finance in order to get right-wing criticism in, as we know.
And, like, you know, even when you asked him about this Eurabia bullshit that he's published, it is so unhinged. It's like Alex Jonesian level of ridiculous, you know? And even after the Christchurch massacre, he didn't take a pause to think, like, shit, you know, that was very wrong of me, because people online were pointing out that how similar that rhetoric is to the Great Replacement rhetoric in the manifesto, right? Yeah. It may not use the same blatant words, but it is that, you know, the ominous birth rates of Muslims, and it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, it's in Douglas Murray's content as well, right? Like, and not hidden. Yeah,
which Sam finds impeccable, actually.
Yeah.
But what was his response to you? It was, well, I don't know, I'm not a demographer.
Yeah, which is that, and he kind of pointed out that there were mainstream figures who had kind of entertained those demographic predictions as well. But it was like Ross Doe had and stuff, right? From my own research, I know that it was the kind of like some of the, you know, centre-right neocon types were the majority of people who were endorsing that kind of view, which is kind of predictable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but they're neocons.
They're not pretending that all their biases are with the left.
Yeah, on a similar note, and I only noticed this, I think it would have been this year, or it might have even been in preparation for the interview I did with Sam, but so he has a quite famous article which he published not that long after 9/11, in a magazine that was kind of saying the West needs to fight back about Islamic extremism, and we need to stand up for Western values and all this. And that article was quite saber-rattly, after 9/11, okay, but it
was quite what, sorry?
Saber-rattly, kind of like, it isn't the kind of thing that would have annoyed George Bush, put it like that, right? It would be in line with we need to be robustly responding and kind of promoting Western values in the face of this existential threat. And there's a mild version of that which everyone agrees with, which is, we don't want totalitarian theocracies. We want, like, representative democracies and like equal rights. So, like, that part everyone can sign off on. So you don't really need to. Only the insane tankies or crazy people who don't. That's a really... I think you don't need to spend that much time on giving yourself a back pat for not wanting to live in a theocracy. But the point about that article was it appeared in the Washington Times. The Washington Times is like the Mooney outlet, pretty openly promoting right-wing, rhetoric, narratives, whatever way you want to put it. And it's a newspaper that is like run by a cult. And that struck me as like really surprising that wouldn't seem, cognitive dissonance. But I honestly don't know, and I didn't ask Sam about it. I think I forgot. But whether he knew what the Washington Times is when he wrote the article for it, or whether he thinks it matters, because it could be either, right? He might not have done any research.
Well, he takes this stance on, how the source shouldn't really matter as long as you agree with the information or whatever. Like, he's often said, like, I would take a point from Hitler if he was right about something, However, he's not consistent in that, because if something is in Salon or Vox, or when Lawrence Krauss accusations came out in BuzzFeed News, he did a whole thing on his podcast saying that he couldn't, he didn't take it seriously at the time because it was BuzzFeed News. And yeah, it's like, okay, so you'll take a point from Hitler, but not like BuzzFeed News.
Not Ezra Klein. He's beyond the pale.
Not Ezra Klein. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think your episodes. I know that there's a lot of people who are fans of Sam that won't listen to it, but I think that if they did, regardless if they agree, overall with because your stance on Sam is highly critical, and you justify it. That's but setting that aside, when you play a clip where he's saying, I extend charity to, I would be willing to, acknowledge that Hitler had made a good point, and then immediately kind of saying we have to disregard anything that comes from the SPLC because it's captured by wokeism. And I kind of like, that's an obvious contradiction, and it's not necessary, because you could be critical of the institutions that Sam wants to criticize. You can take issue with like some of the judgments that they make or the things that they say,
right? But
you don't have to disregard everything they do,
right?
And they do lots of very good research on like white nationalism and that kind of thing, which is an area where Sam has been historically bad. So it kind of feels like he shouldn't be lecturing like Kathleen Belew when she appeared on a Blue. Yeah, thank you. About the appropriate way to approach the far right, because like history has suggested that she's more correct than he is on that topic.
Oh, it's just so funny to me, because, these are not laughing matters at all, because I find them quite urgent and quite alarming, but it is almost comical the way that this all plays out. Like, people get mad when, Sam is compared to Trump because he's such a prolific Trump critic or whatever. We'll talk about that in a bit. But do you see there being any parallels at all, like in the stubbornness and the,
with Trump.
the being so sure of, yeah.
Yeah, so I think, that between you and I, in terms of our approach to Sam, and I know you've been critical of me for this reason, it's definitely true that I have, a better opinion, although I share a lot of the critiques. But in terms of whether it's fair to draw specific parallels between like Sam and Trump, in terms of, I think it is legitimate, and I think in the point that you're highlighting, where it's a kind of certainty attached to their interpretation is just, that's just the truth. It's just correct, and it's not like Sam has the same complete cavalier disregard for, anything being true that like Trump has. He's not like that. But in terms of his...
No, yeah, even I'm not saying that.
Yeah, but in terms of his...
I'm not saying he's exactly like Trump. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that they're exactly the same level of everything, but I just see a certain Trumpiness in him. No,
I'll 100% sign off that, like, I had the conversation with Sam, and it was nice of him to come on and have it, and even when it got, quite testy. And I do give him credit for doing that and, sticking it out for 3.5 hours or so. And I think at the beginning he made quite a lot of valid points about his meditation app, although, that's not the thing that most people focused on. But one thing I will say is that I've talked to a whole bunch of people on the podcast now, lots of different people, lots of like very intelligent people who have interesting things to say and are public intellectuals like Sam. And I've not interacted with someone who has such a forceful sense that their interpretation is correct, and that if you don't agree, it's because you're mistaken. Not because you have a different opinion.
Or crazy.
Or crazy. Well, you get that. I don't get that. I'm probably more represented as like having an unhealthy obsession with policing his networks and interactions and all of the people he talks to. And, that is the way that a lot of criticism gets framed as, well, you're just, who cares that he had a conversation with somebody who eventually ended up to go crazy and that kind of thing. But I know you know this, but I'm just spelling out that, like, if I had a bunch of friends that I had conversations with and promoted and said, these guys, they're on the ball, and in 3 years' time 50% of them had became conspiracy theories arguing that the election didn't happen, then COVID was the vaccines aren't real or don't work and are all conspiracy, I would have serious concerns about my judgment and my social network. But that seems to be regarded as, like, by a certain group of people as being, you're just being unfair and applying a standard that nobody could live up to. And, like, I don't think that's true. It's not saying you can never interact with someone who goes insane, right, or becomes a conspiracy theorist. That happens. Like, people change, but
not like half your friends or most of your friends.
Yeah, and also what you do after that happens also matters. So I've given Sam credit for criticizing Brett Weinstein.
I know this.
I know that's to the ire of many people who see it as, like, it's a very low bar to overcome when somebody is an anti-vaccine proponent in a pandemic. And I agree, it is a very low bar, but it's a low bar that many have not managed to jump. They just smacked into it and fell over. So it is completely true that it's a low bar, but I'm still happy when somebody is like, no, Brett Weinstein is an anti-vax person, and I'm like, yeah, he is. It's really obvious. Like, thank God.
Hooray, yes.
Yeah.
Right. You can have the occasional person that you have praised, especially for their intellect and their open-mindedness and their ability to have difficult conversations and their intellectual honesty, which is above, like, most of the, normie worlds.
Yeah.
And then they go like this. And then most of the people Eve praised go like this. Like, how many are there? I mean, I think 50% is generous, to be honest. Like, there's Ayaan Hirsi Ali, there's Joe Rogan, there's Dave Rubin, there's Majid Nawaz, there's
Lindsay.
Brett Weinstein, and sort of Eric Weinstein.
No, Eric, I put him there. Eric, let's throw him in.
Douglas Murray.
Yeah.
And
Peter Boghossian.
Gad Saad on the, and James Lindsay has also been, promoted and highly praised by Sam Harris once upon a time during the days of the penis hoax or the SoCal hoax. And I mean,
yeah. So
a lot of people were able to see through that back then.
Yeah.
So that's more than 50%.
Yeah, I mean, it depends where you draw the boundaries, because I think like there are people that also get criticisms for like justified reasons, I think, and some that I probably disagree a bit more with. But like Jonathan Haidt, Steven Pinker, that kind of wing that was never really presented at the core of the IDW, but was at least associated with it. I think they've done better, right? Which is that they have not promoted anti-vaccine misinformation, and they've not promoted election fraud, and they were happy when Trump lost. Like, these are low things for people on the left.
Extremely low, yes, yeah.
Yeah, but it's kind of depressing that these are still things. Like, I'm glad to see that in the heterodox space that there are people doing that, and I think that the Joe Rogan stuff as well, like, that's been presented as a really complex topic where there's lots of issues to debate and stuff, and I kind of feel like it's not. You can take whatever stance you want about whether Joe should be kept on Spotify, but most of the critiques are saying, yeah, but look what he's promoting, look what his content is, and acknowledge that, and then take your stance. But many people, like you did on the episode, they don't actually grapple what Joe's content is or has been for a long time, and they kind of defend this version, which is very easy to defend, which is just like, it's fine for people to have conversations, including challenging conversations with controversial people. Like, yes, sure, but that's not all he does. And, and Sam and Coleman Hughes kind of presented it like, if the world was full of Joe Rogan, that would be, it would be a utopian. Like, no, it wouldn't. He's like defended Alex Jones for 20 years. Like,
oh my God. Yeah. I mean, those were some takes. Like Sam Harris saying that Joe Rogan is the cure for racism. Like,
yeah.
I mean, it just might be my lady brain, but I can't wrap my head around that. Like, how does someone...
Yeah, it is an odd argument to make, because like I can't, I heard your episode when you were making the point that Sam and all the people had kind of stated, including like black athletes in the UFC who are very defend Joe Rogan like very strongly, and they basically want to say he's not a racist. He doesn't come across as a racist to me, and he's never treated me like that. I always seem a very nice guy. Yeah. But like, you can, the bit I don't get is you can take that stance, right? And you can say, that's not, I don't think he's that the way he's being portrayed. But you also have to say, right, but he did say that that he was in Planet of the Apes when he was in a black neighborhood. And then he did say that the best combination would be like a black body and a white brain, and black people and white people's brains are different, and like that's not on the edge racism. We're like, well, is that racist, or is that just a joke? Like, if it's a joke, it's a racist joke. So
exactly
you can take whatever stance you want, but I wish that people were saying, okay, so he did make a racist joke, and presumably he made more of them if those are the only the ones that people are highlighting, it's unlikely that he never made any other such jokes. So, but there's this like thing where people, and you noted that Trevor Noah had made this point, right, in the second video or second time that he addressed it. He was like, yeah, but it was a racist joke, right? And I don't know why that would be hard for people, because you could even still issue the defense, right? You could say, I know Joe, he's not like this, he may have said that, but that wasn't the take. The take was like, there is no definition of racism that can include Joe Rogan.
Yes.
Wow.
Like, tell me, how is that not Trumpy? That's so Trumpy.
The tendency towards overstatement when it comes to, like, I maybe suffer in slightly the opposite direction, and I think a lot of academics do, where we want to caveat things and we want to say, well, not in that situation, or this one, maybe this exception.
Oh, well, Harris does that too a lot, but
he does the thing which you said, which is he doesn't mind to say all of our institutions are captured, or to say there is no universe in which Joe Rogan could be called a racist by anybody's standards. And it's like, that's a big, those are really big claims. And when Sam made that point about institutions on the episode where I was, or the interview we had with him, I was saying, he was talking about wokeism, or CRT kind of taking over all schools, all like primary schools in the US. And then I don't know about the curriculums in the US, so I was saying, but is that really true? Like, is that true? And then he switched in like one sentence to say, well, in LA, like private schools in Manhattan, yes, it is. And I'm like, right, but private schools in Manhattan are not all of the schools in the US. And like that switch from all schools in the US to some private schools in Manhattan, it's like, that's a massive leap. But he just did it in a sentence. So I cannot do that. Like, that would be whiplash,
right,
for me.
So he did this majorly in my conversation with him too, and I think, if I remember correctly, that's the first time that I came across you on Twitter, is that there was a clip from my podcast with Sam that went very, very viral, like, I don't know, 3 years or 4 years later. I think it was like 2019, 2018, maybe? Something like that. Not too long ago, but far enough away from the conversation that it like hit me in the face again. So this was a point that I was bringing up to him, that I thought was like a slam dunk, like he's going to see my point, because, I used to be at a point similar to where you are, like trying to be charitable and nicer and like having hope that it is just out of ignorance, that he doesn't know these things, and so if I just provide him with the information, he's going to understand, hopefully. And so there was this one point where I was like, okay, so Anne-Marie Waters, right? She's so racist, Sam, that she thinks if you aren't anti-immigration, you are pro the rape of white women.
Oh yeah.
That's something that she said to me and Mariam Namazi, I believe. And I thought, oh yeah, Sam's going to be like, oh wow, that is, whoa.
Yeah.
Instead, he said, yeah, but she's right. And I'll like,
yeah.
Even in that moment, I was like stunned into silence. So like you can hear that there's just a little like, what?
Yeah.
For me,
I remember that part in the interview where you kind of gasped and laughed and saying, what?
Yeah.
Like, and I will say that as I said, I actually had a similar anticipation that, Sam might take the opportunity discussing with someone that's critical of him, but that has, like sympathy for Matt and I myself, like the co-host on Decoding the Gurus, we're pretty open that we're center-left people. We're not progressive, and like that puts us closer theoretically.
I haven't noticed.
Yeah, I know. It's of course it's well, there is a thing where sometimes people present it as if, you know, have you noticed that Chris is, you know, like the like a center left or, you know, a neoliberal shill, and I'm kind of like, yeah, I did say that repeatedly. I'm not hiding where how moderate my politics are, but that definitely puts me, you know.
We'll talk about that, but let's finish this.
Sure.
I definitely want to talk about that a bit more, but yeah, go on.
So that puts me, you know, regardless of whether you know, think I'm a centre-left neoliberal shill or a secret neocon, but in either case, I'm closer to Sam's politics, right, than somebody that's on the progressive end. And so it could be the case that, you know, he could have used the discussion to moderate positions and kind of say, walk back like some of the more extreme claims and kind of acknowledge, for example, that you were correct in your assessment and he got things wrong. And he didn't. And I will say I was surprised that was the way it went down. I guess you wouldn't have been surprised, but I expected in the same respect that, you know, when you highlight some inconsistencies or some takes which now seem extreme, and even at the time were, you know, the demographic projections or the thing about civil war in France, but there are very few points in the conversation I had with Sam where he concedes anything, except at the beginning where he's talking about the meditation app, and when I think it was good that he acknowledged that his interpersonal relationships bias his charity towards people, right? Even though he refused to extend that might make him sympathetic to people, you know, to a certain category of people, because your friendships are not randomly distributed. But
that's a very low bar. Again, he was only saying that if he knows someone personally, he'll just be like nicer to them or hesitate more in calling them out.
That's right.
Which is like not.
But he did say, this was before the conversation went a bit more south and became hostile. He did acknowledge that, like with Majid, it's the case that he doesn't want the look, right? Like, so that's admitting willful ignorance, because he must know what he'll see if he looks at Majid's timeline. Right. And I can understand that, you know, on a human level, I completely get that. But on the level of you're a public intellectual with a platform and your argument has always been, you know, ruthless truth-telling and willingness to, you know, offend.
Intellectual honesty.
Yeah.
Correcting yourself when you're wrong.
Exactly. So yeah, that was just that was at the beginning of the conversation, but there wasn't really any other walking down of points apart from that point, and so yeah, I was significantly surprised at the stance that he took, and it probably does mirror the experience that you had like a number of years previously. But I didn't. Yeah,
it was very deja vu listening to that.
And I didn't have the like Amory Waters type thing, right? Like there wasn't that. I don't think he said anything that was as extreme as that.
Oh, he did say something. I wrote it down. I'll read it out word for word, because I don't want to be accused of taking him out of context.
Yeah,
misrepresenting.
But I will say I don't like. Although I definitely am more, you know, charitable towards Sam, I basically don't have illusions about his content or where his sympathy lies or his biases. I don't think I do, and I think that applies to almost all of the people that we discuss. I'm not like blind to where their politics push them or the kind of people that they're willing to, you know, have polite conversations with, and what that signifies. So I do know that other people, you know, draw the like lines more in different places than I do, and would regard like myself and Matt for being too charitable and on like the negative side of even being apologists at time for their content. But I push back that I think at least we try to flag up all of the surrounding context that that we think is relevant. We are trying to extend charity, but not at the expense of acknowledging what people are actually doing. So whether we succeed or not, that is what we're trying to do.
I mean, I did like your Sam Harris conversation better than I thought I would. So, yeah, even though he
No, I just noticed, Aina, this is probably a random point, but I had the wrong microphone activated, so probably the sound quality will be better from now. So I'm very sorry about that. It automatically went to the earpod. So anyway.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you do sound much clearer now, but what was I going to say now? The thing that Sam said on your podcast, so firstly I was saying that I liked it a lot more than I thought I was going to, because when I heard that you guys had a conversation with Sam Harris, my first reaction was like, oh God,
to be fair, I think that's probably the reaction of a lot of Sam's fans as well, because they're not overly fond of me. So
I totally get that. And that's the reaction that I got in 2016 when I talked to him. Like, I got so much hate, and I thought it was like a fairly pleasant, friendly conversation. Yes, I did challenge him very thoroughly, but I it was clear that I was still a fan of his at that point, So I wasn't expecting that much hate from like the Sam fans, but it went on for days, and I sometimes still get the odd like email about it. But
I will say that his the subreddit and that were pretty strongly divided on the interview I did with him, in a kind of predictable way, right? That the people that are more critical found it gratifying to have some of the points put directly to him, and others felt that it was pedantic and kind of litigating Twitter drama. So
though if you were doing it with like a woke whatever they consider, they would have loved it. The same kind of flagging up all the things, and that's what really bothers me, is the blatant hypocrisy and double standards. And being like an ex-Muslim who, like went through that whole new atheist phase, and, used to get so much like applause and praise from all these people for exactly who I am today, just having different targets, Aina is like a no nonsense, won't take any bullshit from the Islamists or whatever, because I didn't back down easily criticizing the Islamic right or whatever. And now, because I do the same thing towards the Western right, it's like, oh, she's, pedantic and nitpicky and into guilt by association. And before it was like, oh, if you criticize Linda Sarsour and her associations, that's fine. But if you criticize Sam Harris and his associations, that's not okay. So, I've just seen the hollowness so thoroughly and so personally, because I'm like the kind of person that they always prop up, like, Muslim women or whatever from theocracies. We're doing this all to help them, and they've suffered through all this. And the way that they turn on me was like fascinating to watch, like whiplash. Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that you've been pretty vocal in calling out various ex-Muslim people who lean into the kind of embrace of the right wing, and then are presenting it. I don't even know in a bunch of cases if the people are still claiming that they are liberal. I think in some cases they're now like identify that, you know, maybe they'll say the true liberalism is on the conservative right. but those people are, you know, even if, and I acknowledge that this is granting them like a huge degree of charity, but even if you accepted that their criticisms of left-wing politics were right, it wouldn't make sense that then they would align themselves with the right, given what's going on the right now, right? Like, it isn't like the right wing, those, you know, there's this meme that like people in the heterodox sphere like, where it shows them, right, and then it shows the left, and the left is kind of running off in the left-wing direction, and their position isn't moving, and then they're, you know, the barrier for right-wing is like kind of fading over. And apart from the fact that, you know, this is just what happens with time, like positions.
Exactly.
But even the other problem with that meme is that the right stays stationary on the right side, right? Like, as if the right has not moved in the past 10 years, 20 years. The right has become like much more extreme. Like, Trump would have been at least unthinkable in terms of marketing him at one point, and now he's you know, too milk toast for some people's standards. So it doesn't make sense that, you know, the people talk about their concerns about extremism and things going too far, and then cozy up to the right, like the modern right.
Right. And
I guess that's why some people prefer to present themselves as politically homeless, but that's another toxic term, because the if you see politically homeless in the bio.
Oh yeah. Speaking of memes, there's that Scooby-Doo one, right, where they're pulling off the mask, and it's like politically homeless, you pull off the mask, like right-wing hack, you know, always, if someone says that. They just don't want to be called that.
I don't know if you've had interactions with her, or if you, like, what your particular position on her is, but...
Hey there. Sorry to interrupt the episode. No, don't worry, I'm not here to plug an ad for mattresses or razors or underwear or anything like that. I just wanted to ask that if you do enjoy this type of content and want to support smaller independent creators, maybe you could consider supporting this show. Because without listeners like you supporting it, it doesn't grow, unfortunately. And then I have less time and resources to dedicate to each episode. Imagine all the things I could do with your help. So if you'd like to support the show, head on over to patreon.com/nice mangoes, no E in mangoes, and sign up today. And then you'll have access to early episode releases, patron chats and AMAs, and occasional art giveaways too. Aside from Patreon, you can support this show by sharing it on social media or by leaving iTunes reviews. And now I will let you get back to listening.
Like, what your particular position on her is, but I recently had some interactions with Sarah Haider, right, and she ended up blocking me, and that's fine. You know, everybody can manage their Twitter feed as they see fit. But like, the things I was being critical for her were you know, basically like leaning into the same kind of conspiracism spiral that you know, that you would recognize, that is extremely recognizable around, you know. It's just, it's so obvious, and yet bringing that up and kind of writing critical responses to her was presented as like, I think the way she described it was like being a hall monitor, right? Like trying to police her takes, and I find that, you know, given that we've just seen so many people go down that spiral, that if there are people raising that point, like, you can disagree with them, fine, but this notion that, you know, that is really beyond the pale, you know, how dare you, you're such a toxic person, it's like, yeah, but maybe some things that the critics are raising are right, and like
she's like the hall monitor for what? Islam all the time. It's okay when she does it.
Yeah, I don't even know her content that well, but I just, there were clear parallels, but it is that thing where I think if you're calling out people, and it's this kind of good faith, bad faith thing, where basically any pointed critique, which is not really, really softly presented as, well, of course, this person is 90% correct. Their heart is in the right place and they would never do anything wrong. But they might be slightly misled on this one point. Like, if you phrase it like that, people will be okay. But if you say you're promoting conspiracy theories that, are tied in with the Great Reset and are strongly connected to pretty far extreme right-wing things, people are like, that's so impolite. How dare you be so rude? And I know this is someone else that that you've had contentious conversations with, like Aaron Rabinowitz, but he appeared recently on what's his face, Glinner, Graham Linehan's I don't know what it is, podcast.
Oh, I don't really follow what's going on with him. Once he demanded that he be on here for a debate, I just stopped paying attention to him. But that reminds me, though, Chris, let me just say that, I really appreciate how you handle criticism. And we haven't really gone to the criticism part of our conversation yet, but generally, I have seen you handle it, and I do appreciate it, which is why I thought that we could have this conversation more maturely. You have never demanded to be on here.
I don't mind. I'm kind of a glutton for punishment to some extent, but I'll probably regret saying that. But in the case of Aaron, and I'm not going to issue a defense of his debate bro tendencies, but I wanted to.
No, but be careful. You're getting into the rationalist territory where I'm going to get hate for it.
I'm not gonna at all step in that arena. I don't want to, like, for you or for Aaron. But I just wanted to point out that when in that conversation he had with Graham Linehan and co. And it was about over trans issues. At the start of the conversation, Aaron kind of made this point that people are promoting a moral panic, and they're sharing content which is pretty extreme, and whether they know it or not. And they asked for an example, and so Aaron said, okay, Graham was sharing this article written by a woman who has promoted a whole bunch of far-right anti-Semitic tropes, right? She's her content is full of anti-Semitism, and they got so offended at him referencing that they were anti-Semitic, and it was no, he just said to you that you are sharing someone who promotes anti-Semitic content, and isn't that doesn't that say something about your standards, and maybe that you should be more discerning? He hadn't even issued a forceful critique, but the reaction was one of oh, you are such a bad faith operator, you're trying to poison the well, you're saying, and they were the ones that had asked him, well, give me an example where we have done that. And I find that kind of reaction, setting aside Aaron and the whole situation around the Linehan podcast and whether it's okay to debate them or not, that reaction to pointing out when people ask you, give me an example, and you give the example, and then they say, oh, you're so obsessive, you know all these examples, and you're like, you asked for it, you can't do that. And it is a really common two-step shuffle amongst Sam's fans, heterodox sphere people in general. You can only be ill-informed or obsessed. There's no well-informed critics.
Right, exactly. Either you have not heard enough of their content to know what you're talking about, or you're obsessed with them and you should listen to less of their content. There's no winning. And when they ask for examples, you can provide 500 of them, which is why I've honestly stopped engaging. I used to, talking to you is a little bit like talking to myself a few years ago, and I don't mean that in a condescending way.
That's all right. That's all right.
Everything that you're describing just reminds me of all the criticisms that I used to get from the same kind of crowd, and how hard I try to be patient and engage in these conversations and be very, very charitable, and it ultimately was useless. So I honestly got really sick and tired, and I just don't have the patience for it anymore. But I saw your tweet with about Sarah Hayter and how you thought she was a sensible person and how she blocked you, and it gave me a chuckle because I went through that also.
I think there is, and
so the difference is, though, this is pre-2016. I think things were less obvious.
Sure.
And why I think you're too charitable, especially now, is because things are far more obvious now in the post-Trump world. The fact that you thought Sarah was sensible or moderate, I can't remember what you said exactly, but that alone was interesting.
Yeah, and I'm possibly falling into Sam's defense here, but I will say I don't know Sarah's content. I actually, when I say I haven't done research on someone, I actually mean it.
You're right. No, I believe you.
But so I don't know her greatest hits, and it could be that I would not find them that different from Bogosian or similar people. But
they're presented with a more moderate veneer. I will grant that, but they are sort of Sam Harris-ish, where she will say quite concerning things.
I get that, though.
Be seen as the moderate. So there's an ex-Muslim called Yasmin who just blurts out horrific things pretty openly. Yeah. And people can see through that much more easily. Yeah. But Sarah will defend her.
I think I would flatter myself, although I'm sure I'll eat crow on it, that there aren't anyone that I can really think of who has dramatically surprised me in their, dissent. There are things where I think I genuinely didn't think that people would go that way. I always thought Jim Lindsay was bad. I didn't think he would be at the point of saying, they all are just wanting to make us eat crickets so they can kill off 4 billion people. That was a fast spiral from where he was. But it wasn't like it's completely unpredictable from his earlier content, right? His earlier appearances with Very Bad Wizards or, the I Don't Speak German podcast covered some early interviews with him, and he was never, he was never good. He just was not where he is now. But the issue about, people cloaking things in moderate takes and yet still fundamentally saying very similar things to what Rubin or more extreme people would say.
Yeah.
I think the first thing I would say is I completely accept that that's true and that it happens and that it's very frustrating to deal with people focusing on the form as opposed to the content of what people say, right? We on our podcast we've talked about people issuing strategic disclaimers where they'll outline something extreme and then they'll add in a 1-minute caveat, and it doesn't undo the extreme part, just they add in a throwaway caveat. And I take that happens, and I like to think that I'm sensitive to it. And I'm not going to claim that I'm perfect in the in detecting it. And in the case where I don't know someone's content, it's more likely that I'm going to make mistakes. And I would also add that, like, say, take someone, I think someone that probably we disagree on would be like Steven Pinker. Right now, I know what Pinkerite has outlined in terms of Steven Pinker's defense of race and IQ people, and the Brendan O'Neill reason thing where he went around, I don't know if it was more than one event or not, but, talking about the alt-right and the people attracted to it and so on.
Oh, right, that one.
Yeah,
yes.
and also
his political correctness, red-pilling America or something, I believe.
I also know about, his references to Steve Saylor in his material and those kind of things. And so my stance on Pinker,
and he has some shady references in his books of downplaying rape, where he cites some, I can't remember the exact examples because he's never really been my focus. I forget who it was, Christina Hoff Sommers or someone very MRA kind, to downplay rape. And that I found very troubling.
I find a lot of the criticisms that people level at Pinker and at his his work.
And also the Jeffrey Epstein
the
defense, the letter that he wrote.
So I don't want to obscure those or to say they don't matter. They're just minor, just minor issues. They're not.
Right.
But I do think that someone like a Pinker or a Haidt, although with Haidt again, there's been some. I think he was going down a more extreme route and has kind of turned back a little bit from where he was going when I heard some interviews with him. But I know Pinker's academic work as well. That's where I first came across him. Obviously his popular books, but also his academic articles. And in those contexts, I think I also have an understanding of what the parts of him that are good are, and which parts are his political takes or his willingness to automatically assume the Quillette version of the Noah Carl story is correct. These are all things that I don't want to obfuscate. I don't want to say they're not important, but I will say that I think it's possible for people to have, a positive opinion about aspects of Pinker's work or agree with him, generally in a kind of Hans Rosling way about, the stretch of history bending towards that more people are living longer and happier lives overall across the stretch of history. Sure. So
for me, the thing that disturbs me about that most is to what end he's putting all that. He obviously has a political purpose for saying that, right? And that ends up seeming to me stop complaining about bigotry and stop complaining about, stop pushing for progress.
Yeah.
If that didn't seem to be tied in with that, I think a lot more people would be more receptive.
Yeah, and so I think that's probably where the difference comes. If you see Pinker as being primarily about that political...
a status quo warrior.
Yeah, a defense. Yeah. I've seen the nice little cartoons that people made about, war-torn conflicts or whatever, and Pinker popping up saying, on average, the lifespan has increased.
Yes,
and
exactly.
There's plenty of legitimacy to that. But I think that point that you made about, whether you judge Pinker to be fundamentally about wanting to justify the status quo as opposed to primarily being an academic who who thinks that the data supports this interpretation. I do think that colors the way that you see him and interpret him, and I think that I take exception, and probably where we I think we would have a disagreement more is when I see people like Nick Fuentes or Alex Jones or even James Lindsay and Bogosian and so on, I don't just recognize them as that Pinker and Haidt and so on are in the exact, they're basically in that exact ecosystem with those people, and they would endorse those views. I see like graduations that are.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that either.
So
like, that he is the same as Nick Fuentes or Alex Jones. I mean, it's a spectrum, and it is an ecosystem, and there are like concentric circles or whatever of extremeness.
I think in my case then is, like the Becca Lewis, what was that called? Like the influencers network, alternative influencers network.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
The report she did where she kind of, it was really good report showing these linkages about YouTube appearances, and there was Sam Harris was in there, and so were various other people, Jordan Peterson and whatnot, right, who reacted very badly to being linked to these like more extreme right-wing networks. And my case and that report is not in any way similar to the people that would say that was all guilt by association. That's that's invalid. Like, no, she's highlighting very real connections and the network that if you are in that space, and if you are someone like Sam Harris, instead of reacting with bile and basically attacking her scholarship and saying it's guilt by association and it's kind of like the conspiracy diagram, I think the reaction should be to say, okay, I don't agree with these people. I oppose what they're want to promote. So if I'm in these networks with them, I'm going to expend effort now to explain quite clearly why I'm not on board with that. And it does concern me that lots of people don't seem to care, and they seem more concerned about saying, well, that's just unfair and that's mere by association. And I can give an example, which is like from before any of the thing about like Decoding the Gurus or that kind of thing. I wrote an article back when the Cambridge Analytica event happened about the hack of information, and basically I was familiar with some of the tools because of my research, and the presentation of what occurred and what was involved in the data breach in the popular media presentation and kind of the general discourse was really wrong. Like it was a cartoonish version, and I wrote an article that like went viral about some silly headline like nearly everything you've read about the Cambridge Analytica thing is wrong, right? And but when that article came out, it started being shared in part by people on the right, the Brexity types, because it was useful for them because they want to say, all these people saying we use these nefarious motives, or these means, but actually these things aren't effective, and there's no evidence that Cambridge Analytica can do what it claims it could do. It was kind of marketing PR. But when that happened, I saw those takes. I don't agree with those people or their politics. Dominic Cummings shared it on his blog. So what I did then was I wrote another article like saying, okay, let me clarify, because this is being promoted. I want to make clear what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. And I felt that was very important. And then I went back to the original article and put at the top of it, here is a link to a follow-up about points I want to clarify and like responses to criticisms and whatnot. And that to me seemed like an obvious thing that I should do, because my article was being used in a way that I don't agree with politically and wasn't accurately representing it. And it didn't make the article wrong, but I felt like it's really important that I do that, not to be used in a way that I don't agree with. At least I can say outright that I think these people are wrong, and the problem is not, this is not to argue that the Brexiteers are correct. And I do find that there's a lot of people in the, even the better end of the heterodox pool who seem to regard that as irrelevant, right? Like they don't need to explain anything about why they praised Steve Saylor. They just agreed with him at this one point.
Right. And I have done similar things as well, because being an ex-Muslim, you know, if I ever said anything about Islam or hijabs or niqabs or any of that, and it got used by, you know, the wrong people, I would immediately, obviously it's not the same situation, I'm not an academic writing an article, but I would also clarify, like, you know, I do not support the way in which these people are talking about it, and I disagree with them, and that's not my politics. And I also found it very important to clarify that I am not to be used on the side of that.
And just to be clear as well, those were articles on Medium, so they were not like peer-reviewed papers, but they were basically based on the fact that, like, I had familiarity with doing online data collection and stuff, so that, like, you know, whenever there's a tech story that's covered in mainstream media, it's always like insane the way it's presented, but it was a frustration, I think, that had a point, because like my main argument was like what the Brexit people did was that they just did good old fashioned like xenophobia and misinformation. They didn't need these like super, you know, high tech tools. All they need to do was have Nigel Farage stand in front of a poster with lots of brown people, and that was what they did. They did. So the focus on the, you know, on targeted like psychographic ads and stuff, it was just like misleading to what the actual problem is. And the problem is like racism and xenophobia that was rampant. So yeah.
So how does that link back to the Becca Lewis thing, or Pinker?
So the point with that is that I don't think that, I see a lot of the people who I'm arguing are, you know, more reasonable, or that I think there's important distinctions, who react very negatively to these parallels and connections being drawn and dismiss them as like guilt by association or kind of unimportant, or that, like I said with Steve Pinker, right?
While they do them themselves for the other side, but yeah.
Yes, they definitely do have double standards with it. You know, Linda Sarsour, look who she's connected to, or Jeremy Corbyn, look who he talked to, and so on. And I don't mind people doing that. I mind if they only do it for one, like people that they agree with, and then say it's invalid if you, or people they disagree with, and then invalid the people they agree with. But I don't want to make the argument that, like, I think all of the people that I would have more sympathy or more time for their positions, that they don't engage in that kind of demonization of critics or of people highlighting connections to right-wing material. But I think that my view on that is that those are defensive people who don't want to look at that, and who, you know, they themselves are people who always vote Democratic. They don't have sympathy for the far right. I think in the case of like Pinker and stuff, that's true. So they just assume that, well, because that's their views, that they wouldn't be, you know, endorsing like far right rhetoric. And if people do it, that's what the people are going to do anyway.
But when he says things like political correctness is red pilling people and getting them to turn into Nazis or whatever, that's not necessarily direct sympathy, that he's like, oh, you know, I love Nazis. But he is finding an excuse. He is blaming what we call wokeness now. You know, this is now a few years old, for turning these people, you know? And that's the true problem. And that's what Sam did too when Trump was elected. His episode was just about scolding the left for pronouns, for Halloween costumes being called racist. And that's why you get Trump. And you can't blame these poor people, you know, for voting Trump. And it's like, what? This makes no sense.
So I guess the point that I would raise there is, like, you know, that stupid article that came out recently that did the rounds in the online discourse about like which color emoji to use.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Now, the takes that I saw on that article were universally, doesn't matter, progressive, moderate, heterodox, wherever they were that is a kind of stupid waste of time article at this time, right? Like, that's not the issue anybody needs to be concerned with everything that's happening in the world at the minute. And so I can see, and I have sympathy for the people that say, okay, when they see that kind of thing, they get very, they think, oh, this is liberal elites like wasting their time, and we have real issues, and they're debating which emoji it's okay for people of different race to use.
But really, how many people are debating that?
I know.
Like, okay, if it was a real issue and you actually heard people talking about it all the time, then maybe.
Yes.
But I don't think you can put racist Halloween costumes in the same category, because you can have pretty racist Halloween costumes, but
yes,
color emojis are not really an important thing at all.
It's not a big topic on the progressive side of things. But
no, so these articles are written as clickbait. They want to generate those outrage clicks.
Yes, they do.
Like, that's what I think, at least.
I do. I also agree. There's that's the point, because that article, the other one that I think is the gift that keeps on giving for the right. And this isn't exactly the same because it wasn't originally published as clickbait, but like...
Don't say glaciology or feminist.
Yeah, I was. You know it, right? It's feminist glaciology. If I have to hear about that fucking paper one more time as an example, right? If it was so common, why do they always go for that paper? It's been years. Who
was it common amongst, though? It was only the right going on and on about it.
I know. And
it's like manspreading, too.
Yeah.
It's only the right that talked about that. Yeah, it's annoying when some dude comes and sits next to you on the subway and opens his legs really wide, but this is not something that I dwell on often or talk about or think about even. It's gad sad that thinks about it.
I know. And so the part I want to say is like, okay, so if we take that, right, that there are definitely things which appear in like the media ecosystem, whether it's for clickbait content or because of like people just having very strong views about very minor issues, but those exist, and then exactly what you're talking about happens, which is when that article comes out, what should happen is an article gets published in Slate or Vox, who cares? It just, feeds into discourse. Mm-hmm. But what actually happens is the right-wing media gins up all of the heterodox sphere, amplifies it, starts drawing these large, huge things, and that article will end up being referenced for years now, right? It will become a paradigmatic example. But the thing is that does work as a recruiting tool for the right, because I think and it is used cynically, right? In the same way CRT, the outrage over it is being really clearly used as a wedge issue by the right in order to push a whole bunch of their agenda, but it works, and I think that's the bit that I see that like Pinker and Haidt or the people that would be critical of wokeism, Sam included.
But that's because they are helping recruit people by propping this shit up. But I will say, though, when I looked at this feminist glaciology, I couldn't access the paper.
I've read
it. Because I'm not an academic. But I read some articles about it. And it sounds to me like it was really just about, I think maybe they gave it like a title that was meant to get some attention, but really about maybe more women's perspectives in, I guess, the flooding and things that happen when there's disasters related to melting glaciers, and the women perceive it differently and react differently when they're trying to rebuild their lives and their homes. Something like that, if I remember correctly. And that doesn't sound so ridiculous as, it's made to sound.
Yeah, and I agree, because so we actually cover the feminist glaciology paper quite a lot on the next episode that we'll release, because James Lindsay, we did an episode on James Lindsay and Michael O'Fallon, and they won't stop talking about it. It's like there's 30 references in their conference, and so we're not addressing it in, is this paper ridiculous or not? We're addressing it in the way that they're using it, and they constantly use it, right? They're always saying there's all these examples, like that feminist glaciology paper, and I've seen people like Jeffrey Sachs, for example, examine the paper. I've read it, and it's a paper, and if you take the charitable read of it, it's a paper arguing what you're kind of pointing out. The field of glaciology has been dominated by men. There are perspectives from women and also indigenous perspectives that we should pay more attention to. And there might be parts in it where they go too far, right? Like that, where they make a thing which at least I would disagree with, about how on a similar footing we need to put different types of analysis. But regardless of whether you agree with it or not, it's a feminist paper looking at an area that has been male dominated. And then the actual the way that James Lindsay and I think I put Sam and people that I'm and I'm more sympathetic to Pinker and Haidt than I am to Sam, but the way that they use it as well is to kind of suggest that, at the United Nations, when we're discussing climate change, that there's all these scientists there trying to do their work, talking about ice cores, and then the postmodern feminist, neo-Marxist will come into the room twerking and demand that an interpretive dance be treated the same as the data, from the ice cores. And it's they literally say this, and that's obviously not true. Nobody is saying that. They might not,
Okay, so if someone is stupid enough to be recruited by this, they are halfway there anyway, don't you think? If you change your politics because you were, told that your Halloween costume is distasteful, or rather than think about whether maybe it might be or not, or if you were upset that someone had pronouns that you weren't used to, or if that's going to make you change your politics and elect an absolute moron like Trump, then you were halfway there. You can't be blaming wokeness.
No, and I agree. The people that vote for Trump, they own that on their own conscience. It's not other people's fault. You did it, and I take that stance. Yeah. I don't have the view that humans are just like automatons being pushed around by they can't see through things.
What makes this worse is that they used to argue the opposite with Islamists, right? When people would point out, there's multiple factors. Yes, of course, ideology is one, but also, economic and political circumstances and things. They'd be like, the left is just making excuses, and as if, jihadists and Islamists don't have agency, and just because, something bad happened in their lives, a little bit of Islamophobia, and they're going to turn into Islamists. And it's okay, those are bigger things than being inconvenienced by someone's pronouns, or having your Halloween costume criticized. And those things they were not willing to even think about.
Yeah, I discussed a little bit with Sam, right, a debate that he had with Scott Atran about the role of ideology in motivating extremism. And I'm published in that literature and doing research on it, particularly in Indonesia at the minute. And the view, it's a similar thing where this was one of the extreme statements that Sam made in the interview that shocked me, was whenever we were discussing that, and I was trying to point out to him that he emphasizes ideology almost at the exclusion of everything else. Mm-hmm. But in scholars, including Scott Atran, who he had disagreements with, they don't argue that ideology is irrelevant. They just argue that it is like one component, right? And in certain cases, like maybe Western converts, it can be a more significant factor. But in a whole bunch of other contexts, the like socio-political arrangements of the society are hugely more important than the ideological sympathy. And when I thought that is a relatively uncontroversial thing to say, as well as ideology, we need to consider other things. And Sam's response, at one point, he said, in some cases, there might be social or political factors that are relevant. And I was like, in some cases, in all cases, right? Like there's no human that doesn't live in a context with like, social forces and politics around them. But like, yeah, it speaks very much to his view that, religion is about ideas and beliefs that are bad, that motivate actions. And if we can address the ideas and kind of, correct the ideas, that we can undo it. And I think his view about the far right follows a sort of similar thing where he's like, if people are not saying that they outright endorse the ideas of the far right, that means that, they're not, because if they were, they would say that that's what they believe. And like, that's a really naive view about how people work. And it's also, if you looked at the alt-right, if you even look at just the modern right, I understand that Sam and other people like him are worried about the over-application of dog whistles, right? They're concerned that people are doing false positives to detect Nazis.
Yeah, but the cases that they're worried about are like ludicrous, like Tucker Carlson, asking if diversity is our strength or not, in a very troubling context.
But there should be like, it feels like there's surely a more sophisticated and just like, I think an approach that people can endorse, whether they're progressive or they're like milquetoast liberal or even moderate conservatives, that we can all agree when we look at the political environment now that like Sam has talked about that Trump press conference and said that he did condemn like people on both sides, and this is a common trope, right, where the right-wing people will play this video where, out of context, I understand that it looks like, oh, the media didn't report on Trump, saying, look, he said here very clearly. But if you just dig a bit deeper, even the Bulwark, I think, like a right-wing outlet, has published that, no, like the context actually makes it worse because he highlights that he knows the specific group that had a permit or whatever, and like there was only one group that applied to, and it was an extreme group. And like you don't even, it doesn't even matter the specific case, because Trump has so many times illustrated a willingness to, a lack of willingness to condemn the far right in non kind of both sides in terms. So I completely agree that the heterodox spheres, and Sam in particular, is just very bad at like factoring in that people don't always just come up to you and say, yeah, I'm a white nationalist racist and I want an ethno state. Like some of them do, but most of them don't.
Whereas Islamism, you can speculate about all day long, and talk about the concentric circles and how that's feeding into the more extreme. And but white nationalism, even if the guy has a manifesto called The Great Replacement, you just really can't be sure. Is it just trolling, or is it sincere ideology?
Yeah.
I did appreciate you pushing back on that quite a bit, but nothing came of it.
It didn't seem to make much of a dent. So I was curious, Aina, that aside from the tendency that I might have to like overextend charity to people that are undeserving of it, is there other aspects about like what we do on the podcast, I'm not gonna have expected that you put yourself through the multiple hours. But from what you've heard, are there things that you think that we do on the podcast that are that are bad or potentially like harmful, or is that the primary like thing that is of concern?
No, there's a couple more things, but I just want to wrap up the Sam stuff first, and then I will happily dive into that with you. So the one thing I wanted to first quickly address was how it was interesting that, Sam, the ultimate steel manning champion, brought up several people and just dismissed them without backing it up at all, myself included. Though I think when you brought me up at all, I wasn't like surprised, let's just say, because it's not the first time he's just said I'm crazy or mentally ill. And that's not a very good look. Like, I mean, you can absolutely think that about me, but at least, bring something to the table. Yeah. Why are you saying that, right? Just because I criticize you? Because that's what it ends up looking like when you don't back it up. And with Christian, I know you got into a bit more detail, but he said something pretty ridiculous there too. He said, if you read between the lines, Christian is sending me threats of violence if I edit my own podcast, right? So I asked Christian Picciolini what the hell he said to him. And this is what Christian said to me. So I just wanted to read this out. So he went and looked through his email because he didn't remember, and he wrote back, I just looked and I have only 3 emails from / with Sam. And this is the closest thing to fighting words I can find. Quote, you don't know me, but if you did, you'd know I never stop fighting when I have truth on my side. You are covering for racists and throwing me under the bus. You will end up on the wrong side of history here. Cheers. End quote. Does that sound like a threat of violence?
Only if you really read between huge lines. Like no, it doesn't, to be clear. There's like, that seems like a really straightforward, Christian defending his take by saying like he thinks it's true and here's why he thinks it's important to say that. So yeah, if that is the worst that Christian has in that exchange, like, yes, that would be remarkably uncharitable to interpret as a threat of physical violence. Right?
And it's just not something you say like that on a public platform unless you can really back it up. And it surprises me how often he does that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Especially considering how much value he places on steel manning and claims that the left does not do that.
I take that point, and I also, think in those kind of situations, like in the position where I'm in, I do remember him saying that, but it's also one of these things where, like, when someone claims that, right, I got a email that was threatening from person X. Like, there's nothing... Yeah.
How can you challenge that? Yeah.
And then it's not like he's going to go away and check the email, right? And then say, okay, it's like this. So you do end up in this asymmetric thing where people can make claims, and there's, that, like, from what Christian's account is, like, that's just a slur. But that's the kind of slur that, like, if it happened to Sam, that he would basically say the person is, they're not charitable, they're a person who's misrepresenting people intentionally, and so on. So, yeah, so, like, I'm glad to have that corrected, and maybe I can mention it on the next podcast we record. Yeah,
I think that'd be great.
I'm sure people, they don't remember all these details, but like that I think that's fair, because it is quite an extreme claim to make about someone, that they're,
especially someone who is a former neo-Nazi and is trying to change that.
Yeah.
So that could have a really bad impact on his image when he's doing work the opposite of that, So, I mean, unless Christian is doing this elaborate thing and lying to me, I can't say that I've seen all the exchanges between them, but this is what Christian said to me. He just said that, he doesn't stop fighting when he has truth on his side. Like, that's not a literal fight he's talking about.
Yeah.
So it was a bit straight. Like, did you feel awkward, like, when he said things like, oh, she went a little crazy, or Mehdi Hassan is, like, as dishonest an interlocutor as I've ever encountered on the planet? So did you feel like you wanted to say something?
Well, yes and no, because, I mean, the thing is with that I noticed when Sam took digs at people, right? I can't remember. I think he called Robert Wright like one of the most dishonest people he'd ever met, and we had Robert Wright on a couple of weeks before, and it like those kind of passing denouncements of people, I kind of priced into the equation when dealing with Sam, but I had some people on Twitter say, why didn't you ask him to justify those comments? And I would push back here, and I think you would know this as well, Aina, that if I ask Sam, okay, what's your problem with Mehdi Hassan, right? What that would invite is a 4 to 6 minute monologue about all of the things that Sam thinks that Mehdi has done wrong. And I have some criticisms of Mehdi that, that I think are legitimate, but like Sam would have much more. And he would ream out a whole bunch of them in an extended monologue. I wouldn't know the context for a bunch of them. Like, I wouldn't be familiar, and I wouldn't know if Sam is representing them accurately or not. And then my response to it would have to be, okay, so that's why... That's why you think that. And I don't think that's a good use of time, because I can't challenge him on his view of other people, because he could reference, like, if I asked him about you, for example, he could reference, well, you haven't seen our private correspondence. You don't know what she said to me, privately, which is true. I don't know. So
Sure, but I don't see how you can diagnose someone with mental illness.
No. But I mean that if he said that, right? Like, so if I stopped him and said, for you or Mehdi, well, Sam, you were quite disparaging or casually, like, why would you say that? He will list reasons, and he'll make it, I would say it's very likely, he'll reference things I can't check. And then my response will have to be, okay, so that's what you said. I'm sure they have a different opinion. But then I've just given multiple minutes to slag someone off in detail. So I felt in the conversation, and it happened with points that I wanted to raise as well about, relating to things that he characterized about my position or whatever, that I can't address them all, and I don't know enough to push back. So there are occasions where I probably should have, or I should have asked, more about the context. But I think people are factoring in that, I would raise that issue to Sam, and he would be stopped in his tracks, and he would say, well, I can't back it up. And that's not what would have happened. He would. It would have been an extended monologue about how terrible you are, based on all these claims and stuff that he would say, she's misrepresented Douglas Murray, and she's accused me of doing X, Y, and Z. And, I think I know most of the stuff that you and him have had, criticisms, but I'm not encyclopedic, so he could reference a whole bunch of stuff that I don't know. And, that was the calculation in my head for most of the conversation was, is it worth going down a rabbit hole on this point, and on a whole bunch of points I thought it's not, because it, especially midway through the conversation, I was aware that the danger of extended monologues was ever present. So
I guess you could put out your own like disclaimer, like, oh, I don't know about anything about that. Like, that's not my view or whatever. Something like maybe I would have done something like that just so that I'm like distanced from that ridiculous view of that's. But no, I can see how you're cornered into a situation where if you bring someone up with him, then you're like, oh fuck, now he's saying this, and you don't know what he's referencing or whatever. So the Christian Picciolini thing I did want to bring up because I thought that's really
it is, and I do remember him saying it, and it kind of like mentally just pinging up in my head, but also being like, okay, well that's that's I guess I could have contacted Christian and asked him as well, but I don't have any, like, I've never spoke to Christian, so it didn't crop into my mind, but I probably should have, given that it's quite an extreme claim. So yeah, I'd say it would have been a reasonable thing to at least follow up on, but I honestly, after the 3 hours, there was a lot of things that
there's a lot to follow up on.
I didn't. After that conversation, I have to admit that, like, I was just kind of like, okay, I don't want to focus on this topic for a while. That's me for the next while. Like, I don't need to keep getting into this. So I needed a break.
You did try though with the Molyneux point, and that was, I think, one of my favorite parts of the episode, because you did, I think, try to push back a fair bit, and I thought you brought up a really good example when he was being all literalist, like I asked Stefan Molyneux if he's a Holocaust denier, and he said no. So that settles it. And you're like, well, no, is Brett anti-vax or not? And he was like, clever, but it's not the same.
Yeah. Yeah, he did. I was quite pleased with like that comparison, but his reaction was, well, that's clever, but it's wrong for, it's different. It's a completely different category. I was like, I'm not sure it is, but yeah, so
and Christian didn't say that he's a straight up Holocaust denier. Obviously, as Sam also noted, it's a crime, I think. So he's not going to be so open about it, right?
No.
And what Christian said is that he comes very close. Like, he said first, he's denying the Holocaust or coming very, very close to that.
Yeah.
And I think that gives him some room there, because it's undeniable that, it is a kind of a scale. It's not a literal, you're either doing it or you're not doing it. Just like racism, right? And Sam has this pattern. And that you can just see that, where he's like, oh, I asked Molyneux. And to be clear, when he said that he got a legal threat, so many people were like, well, what did you expect him to do? He got a legal threat, so of course. But he also clarified himself that no, if it was just a legal threat, he would have told him to fuck off.
Yeah.
So it's not about that. That he really felt that it is not denying the Holocaust to say, it's the fault of Jewish-led communism and all the other kind of fucked up things that Molyneux says in that context. And then Sam went on to explain his views, right? When he was trying to say that he's not tribal.
Oh, yeah.
Because he's also said that the Holocaust has been brought about, like, in part by Jews.
Yeah.
And he is Jewish, so how can he be tribal? Because he said that, and I'm going to just read his quote. I'm Jewish. I've written
that the Jews are in part responsible for the Holocaust. How tribal is that? Now that's part of my denigration of belief of faith-based religion. It's like, if the Jews defining themselves as Jews for 2,000 years, insisting upon living insular lives among communities that believe antithetical things about God, and thinking that it's important to marry within their community because of the profundity of their religious beliefs and their unique covenant with God. All of that divisive bullshit is part of the backdrop that gave us the centuries of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. So yeah, I'm someone who has
made Judaism itself somewhat culpable in giving us the Holocaust. What am I, a neo-Nazi? What's my tribe? That's pretty fucking extreme. And that's why I feel like he can't call Stefan Molyneux a Holocaust denier.
Oh, right.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so you're saying, like, if he acknowledges that, people making the point about the amount of Jewish leaders and communist movements in like Russia or Germany that led to suspicion of the Jewish people and that actually happened. So discussing that cannot be Holocaust denialism because, just to be clear, I'm not saying that actually happened. I have absolutely no idea about the proportions of like Jewish leaders. I suspect it was no higher than the general population. But in any case, yeah, he's saying that if those facts, if there's inconvenient facts like that, we have to be able to discuss them and to flag that up as anti-Semitic neo-Nazi trope is akin to like not being able to deal with the actual situation as it exists in the world. So he needs to do that too, because a lot of his thought experiments and stuff is orbiting similar grounds, right?
Like, he's saying that in part the Jews are responsible for the Holocaust. Like, that is very extreme and disturbing and a fucked up thing to say.
Yeah, and I do remember like kind of being surprised, like, why are you doing this? Like, this was not a topic that I brought up. Like, Sam, what's your view on the Holocaust? And that was him like digging himself out of as something else, like
of not being tribal, right?
Yeah, but that like. The part there that gets me, that I kind of feel frustrated about, with Sam's approach and with a lot of other people's approach, right, is that, there is a parallel with anti-vax stuff, right? You can go to there's this good paper from 2011, and it's looking at like anti-vax rhetoric in the Web 2.0 era, right? And it's just highlighting all the common talking points that you find in the anti-vax community. Stuff like, the vaccines aren't safe, they haven't been properly tested, it's about, my body, my choice, all these kind of things. And it's got a big list about the tropes, and it's kind of detailing, how they're used and so on. And when you compare those tropes to what happened now with the anti-vaccine movement around COVID, it's 1-to-1. Right, the talking points are almost exactly the same, just repackaged a little bit to apply to the pandemic. And then when people note those parallels and say, look, I'm familiar with anti-vaccine rhetoric, right? I'm a researcher that works in anti-vaccine communities. I've seen this, and this person is promoting anti-vaccine rhetoric. And other people then go, well, no, because he said he likes vaccines in general, or he's not saying vaccines are bad. He's saying that he just wants them to be safe. And I get the frustration there, and that the research or whatever feels, and also that the people are being naive. And it's the exact same parallel with the far right neo-Nazi talking points and the the tropes that you find repackaged in the kind of like more mainstream versions of it, like your Stefan Molyneux, who are still hiding their ideological predilections at that time, to some extent. He wasn't an open white nationalist then.
To some extent.
Yeah.
But now he is.
Yeah, but the thing there is that what I often find, I think this is the mistake that like Sam makes and others make, is that they kind of go, like when it comes with vaccines, they say, oh, So you can't discuss like the safety of vaccines without being an anti-vaxxer. Like nobody's allowed to do studies or discuss surveys on the side effects of vaccines. That's an anti-vax talking point. And the thing is that no, there is a legitimate discussion to be had, right? But that's separate from the way that the tropes are used, and the tropes are they are used in a way that makes them look like legitimate discourse in order to disguise the thing that they're pushing. And it feels like Sam and others are just very bad at detecting that bait and switch, because yes, you can discuss the safety of vaccines. Academics and people developing vaccines do it every day. You know, there's a whole literature about side effects and people discussing it. It's in all of the WHO and CDC guidelines if you read them. And similarly, if you want to discuss the historical events around, you know, the Holocaust and World War II, there's entire fields about people discussing what led to that and what the societal factors were at the time and so on. And people can talk about these things with nuance and sophistication, but you can see that Stefan Molyneux is not a historian doing a deep dive on the role that, you know, resentment about Jewish involvement in communist movements has. Like, no, he's just repackaging the talking point from the neo-Nazis. And like, it doesn't seem that hard to me to spot the difference between those two things.
And honestly, why choose that hill? Why? Of all the people that have spread so much misinformation on Sam's podcast, why is the one thing that he had to edit out is Christian Picciolini saying something about Molyneux when he wasn't even bothered by the legal threat?
Yeah, and that, like Douglas Murray says a lot of things on
absolutely
his podcast,
yeah,
right? And a fact check would raise the questionableness of all of them. But I think, Aina, the difference is that maybe actually this isn't fair because of the point that you raised about they're kind of being tolerant towards slights directed at, you know, I would describe as people in their out group. But I think part of it is maybe that people like Douglas Murray, for example, are often good at kind of couching their criticism in a veneer of, you know, reasonableness and like kind of genteel criticism, right? That they're being, you know, it kind of falls into the rational bros kind of trope, right? That they're just looking at these complex issues and they're trying to discuss them with, you know, rationality and rigor and deal with hard truths where they come up. And I think if you presented criticisms... But
some of Douglas Murray's stuff is pretty... hashtag white genocide, like pretty straight up. It is. So I'm doing him. I'm being way too kind because like Douglas Murray stuff is, you know, it's not dog whistles, it's bells and honks like for miles. But even if you think that Murray, and I think he does do this, moderates his message depending on who he's talking to, and he might moderate it a little bit more for Sam, although, you know, some of their early conversations are pretty extreme as well. But have you heard on the maintenance of civilization? Yeah. And what a title, even.
I think you covered it in like some depth. So it's I'm not downplaying that, but I will say that I think Sam and a bunch of people are very susceptible to things being presented. If you add that veneer of, you know, rational, reasonable debate and criticism, and we're just trying to deal with the historical details here, that they're not very good.
Do you think that would be consistent though?
No.
Like if we try to do that with Islam and you know, all its positives, I don't think so.
That's a good question. So I wonder if you had, the answer is probably no, because I think Ezra Klein does that. Right, like the way that he talks about issues is very much like that, and he's sometimes criticized for it. But if there was anybody who could present those kind of details in a more, detached kind of rationalist framing. Ezra Klein is the person that would have done that, and he made absolutely no ground. So you're probably correct that it isn't just a matter of the form; it's the sympathy towards the general content that matters too. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we can pretty much wrap up the Sam conversation. I think our comparing notes session went pretty seamlessly. I think we agree on a lot of stuff. And
yeah.
Did you find that it took you a bit to process that conversation? And did you come out because I know with me, in the moment, I wasn't fully grasping the full level of extremism of some of the things that he was saying in that moment, even though some of the things I was kind of shocked by. But when I sat back and thought about it afterwards, it just kind of hit me again and again, whoa, this is worse than I thought. Did anything like that happen with you?
Yeah, but maybe a bit different. So, there definitely was a decompression because it was in total, including material that we took out because of, just the editing of, general chitter chatter and sorting out things. It was over a 4-hour conversation. I don't tend to have those in my daily life, and definitely not ones that are, contentious. So that was draining. But setting aside the reaction on the day, I think that afterwards I had a significant period where I felt quite frustrated about the conversation because there was a lot of stuff that I wanted to present particular arguments, and I couldn't get to them because of the way that the conversation was structured, and I was kind of annoyed at myself that I basically had been too optimistic about the way, that we could just have a conversation like we're having now, or we don't need this.
I know that feeling.
Set limits, right? Because doing that felt okay, we don't need to set a formal debate because you can just, people do turn taking and people, it's a discussion, and the way it went was more frustrating because the format was an interview with Sam and him responding to some of our criticisms, and he came on as a guest. So there's a kind of etiquette involved there about letting the person speak and, not being rude to them, right? Because they are taking the time to talk with you about a thing. But then in the content, and as it got on, as I'm sure people can hear, I get more frustrated with interruptions and more frustrated that points aren't being addressed, and we're kind of, people were annoyed with me for constantly focusing on the issue about tribalism, right? But if you actually take the transcript, there's all these parts where Sam says, so you tell me, how does that make me tribal? Or, what is that? And it's okay, if someone says that to you and you think, that you have an answer, normal people respond when someone is you didn't do that, right? And but it's kind of presented as if that was just, I refuse to leave the topic. And it's more, it's a two-way conversation, right? Those things. So I felt frustrated with the way that the conversation was managed, and that maybe it would have been better to structure it as a actual debate with set time and so on, and then on the other side, I kind of as I described, I had naively perhaps hoped that Sam would moderate some of the positions that I think are more extreme and that have been shown to be incorrect, and he didn't really moderate the positions at all, except for, I have to keep saying except for the meditation app. I think that's a kind of separate component of the conversation. But
But even that, I'm sorry, but there was a lot of stuff that I didn't quite buy around that, like how much money he said he spends. I don't remember the exact figure, but
it was
it didn't say, again, something you can't fact check, and again, something that doesn't sound entirely truthful. So
and was that was this is just a tangent. I promise I'll get back to the question, because I think it's a good one, but there was a point in it where when we were about to finish the discussion on the meditation app, I remembered that, there was a point that we raised which people took as really important, where we said like Sam was profiting, like he was giving 2 weeks no money guarantee when he said that he'll give the app to anyone that asks for it for free. And a bunch of people that heard the episode were like, oh, that was one of their primary criticisms was like that Sam is, he's just about the money and it's a multi-level marketing or whatever. And I was like, no, like we actually said in the next episode, that was not the primary point of the critique. That was just like a throwaway comment. And so when Sam came on, when we got to the end of that conversation, because we were going to get on the more contentious topics, I actually thought, oh yeah, he mentioned that in the email. And, it's clear he wants to address it. And we didn't actually mean it as a major critique. So, we can start with something nice where I'll make that point. So I said to Sam, oh, by the way, we raised this criticism about, the free offer and how it's potentially like, a marketing scheme. And we didn't mean to make that as a major point, but I know you wanted to respond to that. And he did, right? And he kind of talked about the things that you're saying, a huge amount of the user base of the app are using it free, and he has to employ people in the Philippines, I think it was, to just to answer all the emails asking for free. And whatever the case of that is, so one of the things that annoyed me afterwards about the feedback from Harris's fans is they were like, well, Sam really took them down on their accusation that he was making profit. And like, we didn't make that accusation strong. I brought it up, and I actually said immediately after, that's fine. We completely, I've no idea about your finances or whatever, and I don't think a primary criticism is that you're primarily motivated in like profiting from your meditation app. Like, I don't know. That's not a feeling that I've got. But in any case, it's not a mean criticism. But that was taken as, haha.
As everything is.
He showed us, and that was frustrating. but just so to return, and I'll keep it brief about the breakdown. I'd say that like as I got more distance from the conversation, it probably did adjust my assessment about Sam, and where some of the strength with which he holds some of his positions, and to what extent like he still holds some of the positions he has. I came to view it as, well, I think that is the only conversation that could have happened if it was structured like that. Like, that's the way it was going to go. And maybe if I had talked to other people that had interviewed Sam, I might have, been aware of like some of the ways that he approaches things which are not that normal in an interview situation. But yeah, that's the polite way of putting it, right? But so that was it. Definitely was an unusual experience, and one that like was quite frustrating and thing. But I still have to say, and I think out of all the people that we've covered on the podcast, he's one of the only ones that came on and actually argued things, and he doesn't tend to do that. So I do kind of acknowledge that he deserves credit for like coming on, and even if I don't agree with the way that he did it, he at least did come on and try to answer criticism. The same as I would credit him for going and talking to you while disagreeing with the content
but you
of
see,
that interview.
In both those cases, it's already clear that it's going to be a friendly conversation. It's not truly someone that viciously disagrees with him. You know what I mean? It's like, in both cases, I think it was like a friendly space. in my case, it was a fan. I don't know if you would call yourself one, and he knew that. So that is why he felt comfortable coming on. I don't think he knew the extent to which I would be prepared to challenge him. And I think his friends were very upset with him afterwards. Like Dave Rubin and Gadsad were really pissed.
That he went on?
Yeah. Because it gave more, I guess, focus and airtime to the things that I had been talking about, that these guys are troubling. Like, they're going in a not good direction. And now, had he known, the extent to which I would question those things, the level of preparation and examples that I would have, I don't think he would have come on, even if, I was coming from a friendly place. And with you guys also, it sort of began with, compliments and nice chat, and ended that way also.
Yeah.
I think it benefits him to show that he can very rarely have conversations with people with differing viewpoints, while still knowing it's a safe space.
Yes, in our case, I think like part of the reason was he's friends with Dave Pizarro from the Very Bad Wizards, and Dave Pizarro, suggested it, and he, I guess, vouched for us pretty much as people he regards as reasonable. So I suspect Sam probably doesn't trust Dave Pizarro's judgment of people's character anymore. But that I suspect was a big part of why he was willing to talk with us, was because he does have people that he trusts. And a lot of it is based on, interpersonal recommendation. So, yeah, they did not.
Right, and now that you've talked to me, he's going to be really pissed.
I do know. I did factor that this is not going to be received well by Sam Harris fans, but I also factored in that I don't really mind, and Sam, Sam talks to Douglas Murray and tons of people that I would consider highly questionable. So, I don't see any grounds that people have, especially the people who want to complain about guilt by association, that it should be out of the limits to talk to anybody who might have more than mild criticisms of Sam. So, if anybody has got this far in the conversation and happens to be a Sam fan and is very upset about that, it feels like they should know that they have extremely inconsistent standards. So, yeah.
Yeah, but they're going to be ultra mad that it's me and that you are agreeing with me on a lot of things. And that's just...
But the thing is, you're right.
You could talk to Richard Spencer, but sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, that's the unfortunate thing, Ina, is you and I might disagree on tone, and there are parts where, and we can talk about them, where we'll have disagreements, but a lot of the times, even if I'm oh, she's saying that in a really harsh way, the fundamental point is correct. And I think people should acknowledge that whether they like the sarcasm or not, it's kind of immaterial, because the basic contradictions and stuff that you point out, they are stuff that people should be able to grapple with, regardless of whether they prefer you or prefer Sam in temperament and character. That's not supposed to matter for the kind of people that tend to regard themselves as Sam fans. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, and they did like me when I was talking about, Islam. So,
yeah,
with the same tone and the same sarcasm.
Yeah, I'm not someone that's opposed to sarcasm as well. I've been known to use it on occasion, but I think I'm probably less sarcastic than you. So that's
yeah, and also you're not a woman, so that
there is also that
really upsets people. Yeah,
my internet experience is significantly different, and plus I'm Irish, so I get there's like a degree of charity that the Irish people get throughout their lives just because of being Irish. That it's unfair and shouldn't be applied to Irish people because we're.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Polite Conversations. You can support this podcast by sharing the shit out of it, making some noise about it, or contributing via Patreon. Patreon.com/nicemangoes. No E in mangoes. Also, you can follow me on Twitter @nicemangoes. If you want to make a one-time donation instead of a monthly Patreon one, you can do so via PayPal. nicemangoes.blog@gmail.com. Remember, no E in mangoes. If you've got an interesting story and would potentially like to be a guest, you can email me there too.